So a little bit, yeah, I'm extension and research faculty. So a lot of what I do is working with the commercial fishing industry, or it's applied research for the commercial industry. Predominantly I do a lot with blue crabs, but also some with shrimp. Tonight we're going to focus a little bit more on the research that I do for blue crabs. Yeah, I know, I'm sure. So this is a scene we actually just last week had visitors from all over the country from Sea Grant programs, and we took them down to Shell Beach, and they were actually able to see our seafood industry firsthand, which even being in the seafood industry, most of them had no idea what Louisiana had to offer. So first, as you can see from the pie chart, after only Alaska, we are the leader in seafood production for the entire US. And if we take Alaska out, because they're just so massive, there you can see in blue is Louisiana compared to green, the rest of the US. And so just in 2016, we had over 1 billion pounds of seafood landed, we have almost 12,000 licensed commercial fishermen. So we have a huge industry here in Louisiana. As I mentioned, predominantly Menhaden is by far our biggest industry, but it's not often known as a seafood because we usually don't eat it. It's usually processed, so it ends up in cosmetics, fish oils, things like that. So that isn't one that most people really know about. And after that, then we have crabs, shrimp, oyster, and wild crawfish are our biggest harvest. So we are the leader, as we mentioned, in shrimp, crab, oysters, and crawfish. In 2016, we had almost 100 million pounds of shrimp harvested from Louisiana waters or offshore waters right off of Louisiana. Over 40 million pounds of blue crab, about 13 million pounds of crawfish. And when I mention that, a lot of you may know, and a lot of it comes from the atchafalaya as wild, or we also have farmed crawfish. So here, anytime I mention crawfish, these are just the wild harvest numbers. This isn't any of the farmed crawfish. So if we included that, it'd be even more. And 12 million pounds of oysters. But a lot of our seafood industry is facing a lot of hurdles. One of those up here, I have the example for shrimp specifically, but you can see up there is in red, or the whole pie chart there, is shrimp that the US consumes. And in red is actually the amount of imported shrimp. So even at 100 million pounds of shrimp brought into Louisiana, we're a really small piece of that pie chart. We're also facing problems such as land loss, as I'm sure many of you have heard about on the news, which is an issue eventually for production, but it's also an issue for our fishermen in terms of access, because they have to be able to be near the coast, and living right near that coast means as they lose more land, they also face problems from storms and infrastructure. So losing that land is a problem both for the resource and for the fishermen to be able to get that resource. They really wanted me to focus on crabs, and that's what I traditionally do most of my work with. That's why we have a Louisiana blue crab out there, Kalanectes sapidus. As I mentioned, it's a $40 million industry, or 40 million pounds and valued at about $50 million. And one of the things to note is that any fishery in the US has to be managed sustainably. That is a mandate for all of the states that manage fisheries as well as for the federal government. But with that, the blue crab industry in Louisiana is the only blue crab industry in the world that has actually gone above and beyond and gotten a stamp of sustainability from an outside independent audit. We have both the Marine Stewardship Council sustainability logo as well as the Audubon Nature Institute sustainability logo. That one's a little bit newer, so it's kind of like getting an organic stamp, things like that you see on different products out there. A lot of different seafood companies are starting to look at trying to get that sustainability logo, and we were the first blue crab fishery to be able to do so. But unfortunately, it also costs a lot of money to be able to get that independent audit. But so far, we are still the only one. We are expecting that a few other fisheries in the US are thinking about trying to get on board. So where do our fisheries come from? So we'll start here with the mature female. So if you see a female with that big orange or dark mass on her abdomen, that's a female that has eggs. She incubates the eggs for about 2 weeks until they're ready to hatch. A lot of it depends on water temperature. And if you see it when it's bright orange, that's a really early sponge. So that's actually the yolks in the egg sac that are making them orange. And once that egg sac starts to turn really, really dark, it's the eye spots on the baby crab that are actually darkening that sponge. And that's how you can actually tell how close she is to hatching. And she will travel down from the estuaries out towards the open Gulf to hatch out the zoea. So the zoea are these little alien-looking creatures, and they go through 7 to 8 stages of these that all look about the same. And they float out in the open water. They can, they can change their directions a little bit with temperature, tides, light cycles, to help kind of move with the tides, but they really can't overcome the currents to swim a whole lot. And they're basically eating other zooplankton and phytoplankton. Eventually, after 7 to 8 stages, these guys migrate, molt back into megalopy, which is another kind of alien-looking creature that still really doesn't look like a crab. But these megalopy are what start to find their way back into the coast. And we know it's done with tides and cycles, and in other parts of the country, they have it mapped out exactly. In the Delaware Bay, based on weather patterns, they can tell you exactly when the megalopy are coming back into the estuaries and back into the bays. In Louisiana, we really don't know the exact science of it. And a lot of other places in the country are baffled that we don't have it all figured out, but our tides are just a little bit different, our wind patterns are definitely different than the East Coast. And after these guys come in, they move up to juveniles. The juveniles then will settle, and that's where they live in our estuaries, and that's part of why Louisiana is so productive. They live with all the plant material, the detritus in the water, the other dead animals, and they have to have that shelter because as we love blue crabs, lots of other animals love blue crabs. And eventually they'll keep molting about 7 to 8 times. I think he'll be good on that. Until they finally reach the adult stage. And most of that time in Louisiana, they're working their way up to slightly fresher water. In Louisiana, we find crabs in almost fresh water, which is really unusual in that most of the other states, like a lot of the other states, the fishery occurs basically from kind of New England all the way across the Gulf. And we're one of the only states that allows a lot of fishing in really fresh areas, whereas like most of the Carolinas have a cutoff at that, what they call the saltwater line, and they can't fish for the crabs above. Whereas the vast majority of our fishery happens in those fresher estuaries. So once we have all these crabs, and they take about 12 to 18 months. So in Louisiana, it's actually considered about an annual crop, whereas the Chesapeake, for example, is more of like a 3-year crop. And just because our water temperatures are so much warmer, that they develop so much faster. So here you can see 2 of our fishermen that works with a lot out of the Dulac area. And we have about 3,000 licensed blue crab fishermen in Louisiana. However, only about 1,500 are actively fishing. Partly in Louisiana, it's actually relatively easy to get a commercial license, and it's actually relatively inexpensive compared to a lot of the other states. So people will hold a license just in case there's a future moratorium, in case they just maybe want to go out, or even recreationally, if you have the crab trap license, you can only have 10 recreational pots. There's no trap limit if you are a commercial fisherman. So we also know a lot of recreational fishermen will get a commercial license so they can fish as many traps as they want. And generally it's year-round, so we'll get into that a little bit more soon as we've had a few changes in the last couple of years. But generally it's a year-round fishery. We do have a size limit for commercial of 5 inches, whereas recreational there isn't a size limit. For commercial there's also no trap limit or catch limit. Whereas recreational it is still currently 12 dozen per day per person. And we do have, if you can maybe see up here, the escape rings. So we have 3 escape rings that have to be in the traps. And this lets out a lot of the juvenile crabs, as well as other fish bycatch and things like that get into the traps. So give you a little bit of my research. One of the big projects, I forgot to mention the fish. So this up here is an Atlantic pogie, or Atlantic menhaden. So you may mention, I mentioned earlier that we have a huge menhaden fishery, or pogie fishery. The problem is those all are fished off large container factory ships. And for those companies, it's just not worth it to save any fish for bait. So almost all of our fish is actually shipped in from the Atlantic coast, primarily Virginia and New Jersey. So one of the first things my lab focused on was trying to create a bait that could be produced locally, because when the summer months got really hot, the refrigerator trucks would stop shipping. So they actually would just stop bringing the fish in, and a lot of the fishermen complained that they didn't have any bait. So we created something kind of like gummy bears. It's gelatin based off of shrimp. And kind of the basis of it was a brown seaweed. It's an alginate. So rather than gelatin like Jell-O, alginate's just a different variety. And here you can see the crabs love to snack on it. And at this point, we have a product. So if any of you feel like going into bait production, that's actually what we've been waiting for, is somebody who wants to take this over. Because at the lab level, we just can't make enough of it. But as I mentioned, usually we have a year-round fishery. However, as part of the sustainability certification, they've increased the number of stock assessments the state is doing for the fishery. And in 2012 and 2014, they actually found that overfishing was occurring in our fishery. And we don't necessarily, so basically there just wasn't enough biomass of the crabs to continue fishing at the same levels. And the fishermen always get really concerned about this, and they're like, we haven't been fishing more, we haven't been putting more pressure out there. And we don't necessarily think that it was a direct fishing problem. There's a lot of other things that affect the blue crab population. For example, here ghost fishing in the traps, so traps get left out, derelict gear gets left out, and unfortunately it's a large problem that a lot of them will keep catching crabs and other fish after they've been lost. And a lot of times fishermen don't try to leave their traps, but they get lost due to weather, or if the boat runs over the buoy and the buoy gets cut, it's really hard to find that trap again. So that's definitely a large problem. Hurricanes, while we really don't like them, for some reason crabs seem to really like them. Years after hurricanes are usually the best years for the crab fishery. We're not exactly sure why. Watch out, buddy. But yeah, between the water, we think a lot of it pushes the water up. It's a new push of fresh water into the industry. And as I mentioned, lots of things like blue crabs. A lot of the fishermen are complaining that they think there's been an increase in redfish, black drum, and really any of the large fish love to snack on blue crabs, either when they're really little or when they get to the same size we like. And our lab has also done a lot of work with disease and tracking disease in the population. And as a whole, we haven't currently found any of the diseases that we know have caused mass mortalities on the East Coast, but we're still trying to track that a little bit and understand more of how disease plays a role. Because in the Chesapeake just has so much population around it that if they have a large die-off of crab, somebody notices. In Louisiana, we feel like in a lot of the areas, if there's a large die-off, something else is probably eating those dead crabs before anyone would ever notice. So we're trying to understand a little bit more how that affects the crabs. But while we don't necessarily think it was directly fishing, unfortunately, we can't control all these other factors. We definitely can't control the weather. We can't really control all the other fish that easily, or even disease in the population. So in 2016, they passed that for 3 years there was an emergency rule. One of those was that, so the 5-inch size limit is when about 50% of the population is at sexual maturity. And so they passed a bill saying that, or passed an emergency rule saying that any immature crab, so even if the females were over 5 inches, if they were still immature, they had to be thrown back. And the crab industry is actually working to make that a permanent rule. Right now it's only for 17, 18, and 19. And then the other one was they started looking at doing approximately a 60 to 30-day closure in 17, 18, and 19. Again, that also got slightly complicated because every time they did it, a new group would come up and be very upset about it. So if you've heard about the crab regulations and heard about all the changes, in 17 they did about a 60 or 30-day complete closure. What overlapped some with Lent, and a lot of the distributors of crabs, they lost a lot of their market. Because even though it was only for 30 days, if a buyer went somewhere else, they found a new market, they weren't necessarily coming back as easily. So then in 2017-18, this last year, they switched it to an March and April, no female take. Which again, they actually determined saved almost too many crabs. They didn't have to be that conservative. So next year, they have actually currently voted and will be taking it to the commission this summer to change the regulation that for 2019, it will be a 30-day no female harvest in the fall. And then we're hoping the stock assessments are looking very good. So the thought is that after 2019, we won't have to have any closures and we'll go back to a full year-round fishery. However, in the meantime, it has been very confusing for the commercial fisheries and for the recreational if they were out fishing at the same time. So we're also hoping that will simplify everything and they'll go to a more consistent rule rather than things changing every year. But so one of the things I also work on through Louisiana Sea Grant and Louisiana Ag Center is we have a contract with State Fish and Wildlife to actually do all of their professionalism with the industry. And with the crab industry has been one of my focuses because we've been trying, as the fishermen haven't been able to fish as much or haven't been catching as much per fisherman, trying to help them find better ways to make more money so that they can still stay in business. So to that, we have the Louisiana Fisheries Forward program that does a lot. We have summits, dock days, workshops. So when we see some of this new applied research or some of the other applied research coming out of LSU, we can take it to the fishermen to try and help them understand how it can help them. Also, as they keep changing the rules and regulations, we can try to get that out to the fishermen through fact sheets, through the workshops, because otherwise it can be hard for them to know exactly what rules are changing. The State Department tries to get that word out, but unfortunately, it's often in press releases and local papers may or may not pick up that press release. I know for the 2017 closure, it had been announced almost a year in advance, but a month before I was getting tons of phone calls of there's this closure coming out of nowhere that no one knows about. Because unfortunately, the state can't always get the word out very well. We also do a lot of fact sheets, so some of the fact sheets that were out by the live crab out there. We also have a video series that explains how kind of best practices for each of the major fisheries, including blue crab. I also think it's really good because if you're not real familiar with the fishery, it really goes through the details of what that fishery is. So I think it's a great resource, even we've mentioned it for like grad students and college students to help understand the different fisheries. Another project we do is trying to help work with the fishermen, like I said, to get more money and to get more better value, to have a better product. One of the current projects my lab is focusing on is working with the softshell industry. So softshell in Louisiana is actually considered aquaculture, and it comes from our wild harvest. So they harvest wild peelers or buster crabs, and they have to keep them in trays until, which you can see up here, until they get close to molting. And based on that back paddle fin, they can actually see a color change. I can see the really obvious change. A good crab shedder can look at it and tell you within days to hours of when exactly it's going to shed. Fortunately, I'm not that good at it yet. But one of the things we noticed as we were trying to do a lot of these outreach programs with the fishermen is our industry in Louisiana was just rapidly declining. So we used to be one of the leaders, and this we've been actually working a lot with the Chesapeake, with Maryland and Virginia. We always kind of felt like Louisiana, Maryland, and Virginia led the country in softshell production. And when all three of us started looking at our numbers, we realized that a lot of our production was gone. Here in Louisiana, we think a lot of it is most of the shedding systems were right on the coast. And after every major hurricane that's come through, we've seen a huge decline in producers. It's also labor intensive. Crabs will molt all night long. And you have to pull them out of the water within a couple hours or they start to harden. So you have to be prepared to check those crabs every couple of hours all night long. So if you've lost a shedding system in your house in a storm, I can completely understand why you're not real likely to get that thing that you've checked all night long up and running as the very first thing. But the softshell industry usually there's about a 7 times increase from what they can get per pound as a hard crab to what they can get as a softshell crab. So the fishermen can get a lot more money because almost all of our shedders are also fishermen. And we've just noticed, even as we've been looking at the import data, that a lot more of our softshell crab is coming in as imports. And we realized just as a whole, the softshell industry across the US has really declined. And so we're trying to kind of focus on that and focus on the roles disease play to see if we can help increase production so that we don't completely lose that fishery.